if this conscious being of the devil is what evil is, when he acts in order to bring, say, cancer on a human, or to erupt a volcano, or when he does something that under your view would count as natural, is it in all cases he is deliberately doing this? So like, does he deliberately go out there and go, that community in the third world, I particularly don't like the third world, so I'm going to have more disasters happen there?
I would actually say that naturalism on an intellectual level does a good job of solving the problem of natural evil. One of the reasons, not the only reason, that I still feel more persuaded by the Christian view is actually because it doesn't make sense of my emotional response. When we call something a disaster, or when we say we want to fight cancer or battle mental health, we're actually saying that there's something wrong with the world. That response to natural evil can't be accounted for under naturalism.
Hello, and welcome to the Unbelievable podcast, where we bring together Christians, atheists, agnostics, and everyone in between to discuss the topics that matter most to all of us. I'm your host, Vince Vitale, and today we're going to be discussing what is sometimes referred to as natural evil. For example, earthquakes, famines, and cancers. Evil that appears to be baked into the fundamental nature of our world, a world that sometimes seems like it's falling apart around us. These are heavy and difficult topics to consider, especially in light of the fact that many around the world, including some of us and some of our loved ones, may have suffered from these types of evils. To all of you listening, we appreciate you being with us. Here with me today on the show is Sharon Dirckx, a speaker, author, and Christian apologist who spends much of her time responding to people's questions about faith. Originally from a scientific background, Sharon has a PhD in brain imaging from the University of Cambridge, and she's the author of multiple books, including her most recent, which is titled Broken Planet, and combines real-life stories with intellectual arguments in response to the question, if God exists, then why are there natural disasters and diseases? Sharon, wonderful to have you back on the show.
That's great to be here, Vince. Thanks for having me.
Also joining us today is Stephen Woodford, a well-known and influential YouTuber with over 41 million views. His channel, Rationality Rules, is dedicated to dismantling religious and supernatural beliefs. In a recent video released in January, Stephen challenged Sharon's claims about natural evil, setting the stage for today's debate. Stephen, great to have you with us.
Vince, it's a pleasure. Thank you for having me. And Sharon, it's amazing to be able to have this conversation with you. Thank you both.
Yeah, likewise.
Excellent. Well, all right. Well, let's dive in. And let's start by making sure we all understand the challenge at hand. Sometimes referred to as the problem of natural evil or the problem of teleological evil. Stephen, could you start us off by summarizing what that challenge is for the person who believes in God?
Of course. I'm going to take us back slightly so that we can start with the problem of evil per se, and then introduce the naturalistic elements. So the problem of evil, simply stated, it's a philosophical and theological dilemma that questions how an all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-loving God can coexist with the existence of evil and suffering in the world. It's something that's been contested since the time of at least Epicurus. It's something that has challenged many people's faith, and it's something that's probably going to continue to be a topic of great discussion. The essence of it is that if God is omnipotent, he has the power to prevent evil. And if he's omniscient, then he knows when and where evil exists. And, of course, if he's omnibenevolent, so all-loving, he should want to prevent all suffering. Yet, evil and suffering persist, which poses a challenge to the traditional understanding of a perfectly good and powerful deity. So that's the problem of evil in a nutshell. And what it implies is, when we look at evil states in the world, it cannot simply be what's known as gratuitous. That is to say, it cannot be something that is straight up evil. Rather, it has to serve a greater good. And the reason for this is that it naturally just follows, because God is all powerful and he's all loving, he would necessarily create the best of all possible worlds. And actually, it's a limitation on our understanding of the world as to why we can't get around how we can understand that it's not actually gratuitous evil, but actually is for the greater good in the end. Now, applying this to nature and to teleological aspects in general, teleology meaning like design, it's designed this way. What we have is, and I will just get my notes up. So what we have with gratuitous evil is God is responsible for creating all species. He's responsible for creating the entire universe and the world. And what this means is that whether he used evolution or creation, depending on what your stance is, he has made it so that we need to, for instance, eat flesh in order to survive. That's something that predators have. Humans are omnivores, technically can get away with not doing that, but there are plenty of animals where that's not the case. God has designed the world so that volcanoes go off, and these volcanoes can cause incredible disruption and damage to ecosystems of not only humans, but of course animals. You have forest fires, like what we saw in Australia in recent years, which has torched entire neighborhoods, ruined entire ecosystems. And these things have been going on for billions of years. I guess if you're a young earth creationist, you may contest this, but then you're going to fall into other problems with bumping your head up against science and what the various scientific fields have to say about the age of the earth and how long species have existed. But in any case, you have this vast amount of suffering that, at least on the surface, much of it seems to be completely gratuitous. A good example, or at least an example that resonates with me, is the extinction of the dinosaurs. 66 million years ago, we had, to the best of our knowledge, a comet come down, an asteroid, and it hit the Earth, caused debris to go into the sky, it caused volcanoes, it caused a blacking out of the sun. This would have affected billions of innocent creatures. Billions. And if they were sentient, if they were able to feel pain, if they're able to empathize and have emotions, much like we believe other animals can do right now, then this is a very serious problem. Why did that occur? And the challenge is that the theist who believes in an all-powerful, all-loving God has to have not only a possible answer, but a probable answer. Something that isn't just, this could be the case. It needs to be, no, here's a compelling reason for it. And my contention, as is the contention of many people that have left faith, and also many atheists in general, is that this challenge has not been met by Sharon or indeed anyone.
That's really helpful, Stephen. And Sharon, obviously, we're going to give you a chance to respond to that challenge. But before we jump to that, I would love to hear from both of you why you care about this question, why you think it's an important question that our listeners should spend time learning about. So, Sharon, I'll start with you on that. Why is this question important?
Yeah, I think this is a vitally important, and actually, just thank you, Stephen, for laying out the argument. And actually, what we want to do as Christians is actually respond to the heart of that argument that you put forward, and I look forward to doing that. But the reason why this is so important is because it's really vital in terms of how people are thinking about whether God exists or not, and not so much even whether he exists, but what is he like. There was a theologian that said, the first thing that comes into your head when you think about God, or even the God that you don't believe in, is the most important thing about you. And I guess at the heart of this question and the matters that surround it, perhaps, we have kind of mental images of the kind of God that might exist, even if the world is the way that it is, and that isn't a particularly attractive God that any would want to believe in. It's also a really important question because there's just a heartfelt reality of life. These are questions that come to land in a very real way for each of us. There are so many different kinds of natural evil or natural disaster. Some of them we experience from far away, and some of them we experience close up and firsthand. Illness in our families. For me, one of our journeys has been with my husband having an illness that doesn't really have a name. It's not really properly understood, and what's that all about, and how do we navigate that? And of course, some people have had experiences that have caused them to decide that God doesn't exist, or if he does, isn't worth following, and so have walked away from faith. And so this is a really important question to address. And I guess at the outset, I would want to say that even though there's a lot that we don't understand, and we're not going to get to the bottom of this question today or even ever, um, and I'm not here to try and give trite or kind of boxed answers. But it is still possible to believe in a God who actually does love people and the created world, even in the face of all kinds of evil and suffering that are embedded into the natural world.
Thanks, Sharon. And Stephen, does that to some extent capture why you see this question as important, or are there other things that you would add?
Well, one of the things I share with Christians, obviously, who I don't share the same worldview with, is a deep interest in theology and indeed philosophy. Because a lot of, especially people that want to defend their faith, they will get into philosophy. And so we have this shared interest. And I've always, from a very young age, I've wanted to know, why are we here? What's our purpose? What's going on? And that has never ceased, and it will never cease. And I'd be very sad if it did. I'm always going to be asking these questions and pursuing them as earnestly and honestly as I can. And that is why I care about this topic, and it's why I relish the opportunity to be able to speak with people, especially who I disagree with, because they might know something that I don't, that can help me out on this journey, if you will. But one of the things, what perhaps the best argument for there not being this God, this God of the Bible, this capital G God, the omni-max God, all-loving, all-powerful, and all-knowing, can be encapsulated with a quote from Darwin, which I'll quickly read now. And this is a launching pad from where I really come into this specific dialectic. So he wrote this in a letter to Asa Gray in 1860, and he said, "I cannot persuade myself that a beneficent and omnipotent God would have designed the wasp," and specifically he mentions a specific wasp, but it's not needed here, where what the wasp must do is feed within the living bodies of caterpillars, or that a cat should play with a mouse. And what he was indicating here is teleological evil, that is evil that God, if he exists, has designed into the species itself. There are plenty of examples of this in nature, but of course this one comes up with the wasp. But that's what springs me into this conversation. It's just an important one. What could be more important than if there's a God?
And Sharon, looking forward to your responses to that. But one more fundamental sort of question as we kind of just get our bearings here. I'm wondering, do you feel you need an answer to this question about natural evil or disasters in order for your belief in God to be rational? In other words, why can't, as a believer, why can't you just say, well, God's ways are higher than my ways. I don't know why he allows these terrible things to occur, but I have some other reasons for believing in God, such that I still think the overall, case points to his existence. Do you think that is a sort of response that a believer can take? Or actually, is there a deeper need to have an explanation for some of the things that Stephen is bringing to the fore?
I think so. I think if something is true, then it ought to make sense intellectually at a mind level, but also be able to kind of help us make sense of the gritty reality of life. We talk about where we were when the Boxing Day tsunami kind of hit, the shores of the Pacific Ring and Indonesia, and the hundreds of thousands of people whose lives were impacted by that. Every human being matters. And so, if God is real, if God actually exists, then there ought to be some things that we can say that help us make sense at an intellectual level, but also can be grounded in reality and help us walk out the daily, what it means to live in a life that involves suffering and the suffering of those around us. And that's actually why in my book, Broken Planet, I took this two-pronged approach where I'm looking not just at the arguments, that the sort of intellectual arguments that might be helpful, but also grounding it in stories of people that actually have been caught up in all kinds of natural evil, from wildfires to earthquakes to tsunamis to locust infestations and so on, who have continued to believe in God, and actually their experience of natural evil hasn't stopped them believing in God. And I want to ask, why is that? What is it about the God that they believe in that means they can experience this firsthand, but yet still hold to belief in a kind, loving, powerful God? It's a mystery as well. I'm not using that as a get out clause, but I'm not here to give overly simplistic answers, Stephen. I think this is a deep matter, and we can. But what I want to say is, where do the most persuasive explanations lie? Where do the most persuasive answers to this question lie that provide us a framework for making sense of natural evil?
What about you, Stephen? That response of "I don't know," would that seem like a cop out to you, or would that seem honest and perhaps the sort of response that a believer could give if he or she felt that they had other reasons for believing in God? I found this quote from you. I found it challenging. You said you'd think that theologians and apologists would simply say, fair enough, this piece of evidence fits better on naturalism. But no, they need to make out that everything is perfectly kosher. Would it be reasonable for the theist to say, actually, God's ways are higher than my ways? I don't know the answer to this question. Maybe even I'm not surprised I don't know the answer, because I wouldn't expect to understand everything about why God does the things that he does, given that he's infinite and I'm finite. But look, I think I have these other good reasons for believing in God. And so I think the overall case still points to him. What would be your sort of reaction to that type of approach?
So on the one hand, it's commendable. It is actually really quite rare, especially with apologists, that you'll get anything anywhere near, okay, this bit of data is better explained on atheism. Even though by my lights, that should be the first step of humility, which is a quality that many Christians claim they have, and many do, but I don't think that's the case when it comes to apologetics. It seems to be a different game in general, and I'm not saying that Sharon is part of the apologetic circle, but this is what I deal with online. I deal with people that are preaching on stage, people that their goal is to win. It's not necessarily to find the truth, and consequently admitting any kind of, okay, this data does make more sense on the view that I don't hold, would be viewed as weakness, as a deficit, whereas I actually think it's a strength. So suppose, for instance, we were talking about the shape of the Earth, and we come up with a piece of data, for instance, that it looks flat. This data is actually predicted on the spherical Earth if you make the sphere big enough, and it's also predicted, of course, on the flat Earth. But in and of itself, it is just a bit... the evidence itself better fits a flat Earth. So someone that believes in a spherical Earth could look at that and go, fair enough. And your question of can someone do this with gratuitous evil is, I would answer no. The reason for this is that God is all-powerful, which means he can do anything. He's all-knowing, which means he knows it all. And he's all-loving, which means he will enact the greatest of all possible worlds. So there's no room for that to be anything other than the best of all possible worlds. Epistemically, so from their own perspective, they could look at it and go, I don't have an answer for this, but I do believe in God because I have X, Y, and Z. And in that sense, yes, you could be justified, I think, but you'd have to have a faith that, frankly, would eclipse any kind of faith I could ever come to when it comes to this one topic. But yeah, I think that is certainly the most reasonable view by my lights in response to it.
That's a really helpful analogy that you gave, and I appreciate this posture of even looking to learn from one another and potentially being willing to even concede a point to someone who disagrees with you. Wow, what an incredible thing to do in today's world, in particular online. And maybe we'll just linger there for a second. I'd be interested to know from both of you, maybe Sharon, I'll throw it to you first and then back to you, Stephen. But, Sharon, is there anything about the world or any piece of evidence where you say, yeah, I can see how that seems to fit better with naturalism, at least on first glance. But I feel my case overall still points to God. And then I'd be interested, Stephen, if there's anything in the other direction where you see, yeah, that I can see how that, at least on first glance, seems to point in the direction of something supernatural, though actually overall, I think that's not the explanation. Any thought on that, Sharon?
Yeah, definitely. So I would actually say that naturalism on an intellectual level does a good job of solving the problem of natural evil. In fact, the video that we've both referred to in talks and YouTube videos, the interview of Stephen Fry that went viral a few years back, 2015, when he referred to the worm that causes river blindness, he was actually drawing from David Attenborough's observations, and people have, Christians have obviously asked David Attenborough why he doesn't believe in God when he studies and sees all these incredible things in the natural world, of which there are many, and maybe that needs to be a little bit on our radar as we talk about this. But at the same time, there are also worms that eat the eyeballs of children and seem to have no other beneficial effect. And I agree with you, that doesn't seem to be any other benefit to these worms. And so, at an intellectual level, he rationalizes that by saying, look, these are just natural events. These are just biological events in the world. And there's nothing particularly amazing or astounding about the beautiful things in nature, nor is there anything concerning or kind of wrong with the disturbing things in nature. They simply are the way that they are. And in a sense, at an intellectual level, I think naturalism solves that very well. But I think one of the reasons, not the only reason, that I still feel more persuaded by the Christian view is actually because it doesn't make sense of my emotional response. It makes sense at an intellectual level. It doesn't make sense at an emotional level. Here we are referring to it as natural evil. But actually, if nature is all that there isn't really such a thing as evil. There are just biological events, geophysical events. Viral infections are biological events. Earthquakes are tectonic plate movement. They're actually the flip side of, living on a planet that can sustain life. They have a sustaining role, and it's just the luck of the draw. You get caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, and there's nothing particularly right or wrong about it. It's just the way the world is. But when we call something a disaster, or when we say we want to fight cancer or battle mental health, we're actually saying that there's something wrong with the world. We're actually saying that the way that the world is not how it ought to be. It ought to be different to how it is. And that response to natural evil can't be accounted for under naturalism. That makes more sense if there is such a thing as objective good and also objective evil. So that's how I would take that to the next stage.
Thanks, Sharon. And I'm going to make a note. We'll pick up on that theme because that's an important part of this conversation as well. But before we head to a break, Stephen, is there anything in the other direction that you look at and you say, yeah, I could see how this at first glance maybe points towards a supernatural explanation, even if that's not your overall conclusion?
Yeah, there's some that I think are true, and they do point towards theism over atheism. And then there's some that a lot of other people think is true that I don't, which also would point towards theism. I'm going to sidestep Omnimax God because I think that it produces so many problems. But just theism per se, I would say the fact that we exist is better explained, or at least intuitively better explained on theism. To be clear, I'm not saying fine-tuning. I think the fine-tuning is a very poor argument. It doesn't make any sense of God's powers. For instance, if he's omnipotent, there's actually no prediction on what he could do. He could make life span light years apart, with the atoms being light years apart. There's no predictability. But the fact that there just is life, I think that is something that, at least intuitively, makes more sense on theism, or at least a religious framework, than a naturalistic framework. if you believe in objective moral values, now what I mean by this is if you believe that morality is instantiated in something or somewhere other than ourselves, so it's a very specific idea of objective morality, a religious one, if you think that that exists and that it's stationary and it hasn't changed, I think that that would make much more sense on theism than naturalism. My problem is that I think the data screams that that's not true. The fact that Christians today don't endorse slavery, despite the fact that Aquinas and Augustine and all of the early fathers did. The fact that today we allow women to have conversations with men and to have authority over men, when that wasn't allowed with Aquinas or Augustine, or in fact Martin Luther. Martin Luther spoke incredibly poorly about women, as has most Christian elites throughout all of history. All of this moral development makes much more sense by my lights when you realise you don't have this objective moral framework. But if you did have that objective moral framework, and if you believe in that, that would make more sense, of course, on theism. There are more, but sensitivity to time, I'm happy to leave it there.
That's great. Thank you, Stephen. And we're going to pick up on these themes after we take a quick break. While we do, tell us what you think. Let us know what questions you'd like to see on the show. You can comment on YouTube or get in touch at UnbelievableFE on X and at Premier Unbelievable on Instagram and Facebook. We're just getting started on the topic of natural evil with my guests, Stephen Woodford and Sharon Dirckx. Be back in a moment.
You would call yourself an atheist?
I would, yes.
I would call myself a Christian humanist.
One of the big themes over the history of what we now think of as science has been questioning the exceptionalism of humankind.
I think the critical thing is what gives something value. Would you say that minds construct meaning or detect meaning?
I have had made from a little piece of my arm something that could reasonably be called a second brain.
I think one of the real challenges that evolution by natural selection puts to Christian belief is the idea that
Welcome back to part 2 of this episode, where a Christian and an atheist have come to very different conclusions about how to think about the suffering that is caused by the harsh realities of our natural world, such as earthquakes, famines, and diseases. I'm your host, Vince Vitale, and you're listening to the Premier Unbelievable podcast. Let's pick up where we left off. We've had some discussion about whether or not the believer in God actually needs an answer to this question in order to believe rationally. And it was actually really refreshing to hear both of you say, I can see how certain things about the world might actually point against my overall conclusion. But Sharon, as you've said, you do think it's important for the believer to have a response to this challenge, and you think that you have one, which is why you wrote a book on it. Can you please start this segment of the show by summarizing the main contours of your response?
Yeah. So, I mean, there are lots of different elements to this, which is why it took a whole book to look at it. I guess that the first part of my argument would actually be to look at some natural events that seem to have a life-sustaining role, where actually, for example, tectonic plate movement is used to recycle nutrients from the ocean beds back to the surface. Volcanoes have a role in releasing pressure from beneath the crust. Volcanic soil is incredibly fertile. Even flooding is vital to bringing nutrients in. Mountain ranges are necessary for the water cycle, enabling water to rise and cool and then fall again as precipitation, which supplies vast areas with water. And so some of these geophysical events have a life-sustaining impact. And so one of the views is that actually the disasters, the way that we get caught up with them is more due to the fact that we've become vulnerable to natural events rather than the events themselves being inherently wrong. Now, I'm sort of aware that there are lots of different kinds of natural disaster, and I guess we have to sort of be clear what types we're talking about when we're making a point. And I'm thinking of the bigger cataclysmic events. And so how is it that we've become vulnerable? Well, one of the ways that we've become vulnerable is through the impact of poverty. If you look at the number of deaths due to an earthquake, say in the developed world or the majority world, a world of high economic status. I think that's the best way to put it. And you compare it with the number of deaths of an earthquake in a country with a lower economic status, you will find that there are several orders of magnitude. The number of deaths in the low economic status country will always be several orders of magnitude greater than the other, and often due to the impact of poverty and corruption. If I can just give one sort of concrete example, one of the stories in Broken Planet is from Haiti 2010, and there was a similar magnitude earthquake in California 1989, and the number of deaths in California was 59. 57. The number of deaths in Haiti was on the hundreds of thousands scale. I don't really even know the final figures, somewhere between 150 and 250,000. And one of the main reasons for there being so many deaths was because building regulations hadn't been adhered to, and so buildings, even luxury hotels, pancaked and just crumbled under the effect of this earthquake. People should have been able to evacuate to safety, but they weren't able to, and the reason was more due to human negligence than due to the fact of the earthquake itself. Now, I'm well aware that doesn't get us around the question of why there was an earthquake in the first place, and I do want to get to that. But one of the things is that the problem isn't so much with nature, but with our relationship with nature, and that we have become vulnerable to it. Yeah.
Thank you, Sharon. No, thank you. That's a lot to chew on. And I think at times you've put it by saying there's no purely natural disaster. Let me let Stephen pick up on these themes as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And by that, I mean, I don't mean that there aren't any natural disasters. And what I mean is every natural disaster is a complex combination of natural events in the world and human beings making them worse as well.
Great. That's helpful. Jump in here, Stephen.
If I may begin with a question then. Sharon, what role did we play in the extinction of the dinosaurs? Well,
I mean, so I think it's really important that we are kind of thinking about so I agree that the argument, it depends on what you're talking about. And as I develop my own argument later, I also make the point that there are some natural disasters that seem to have no beneficial role and no human contribution. So I agree with you. There are some events in the world that don't fit either of those categories, but some of them do. And it is worth making the point, especially when people raise the question, why do so many people suffer when there's an earthquake or a tsunami? Part of the answer to why so many suffer is human contribution, human failure to respond, failure to evacuate, failure to heed the warning signs, and so on. I'm not saying it's the whole answer, but it's part of a few puzzle pieces that fit together.
Wouldn't your admission of some natural disasters not having human components render your bold claim of there being no truly natural disasters false?
No, I think so. I think I would say that it becomes that actually different kinds of explanations are needed for different kinds of disaster. And I also, the way that I unpack things in my book is that I talk about these three elements. And I don't know how soon you want to get into this, Vince, but I talk about natural factors, the way the natural world is. I talk about human factors, the way that humans behave and interact with nature, and the extent to which we help each other in our relationship with nature. And then I talk about spiritual factors. And I think that there are, and here is where I'm aware that, we become, you're a naturalist and I'm a theist, and we have different frameworks for making sense of this and to thinking about this question. I'd be happy to say more about that at this point, Vince, or unless you want to pause and go back to Stephen.
No, that's great. Let's get to that. Let's get to that in just a couple of minutes, and maybe we'll just stay here for a moment. Stephen, this quote by you I thought was kind of a helpful analogy. You said, "Just because we can throw gasoline on the fire."
Would you mind if I replied to some of the other comments? Because I wanted to just point out that by my lights, that's a contradiction. In Sharon's view, if she says that we're not involved in the extinction of the dinosaurs, to just give one instance, then you cannot say that there is no such thing as a natural disaster.
Let me just finish this quote from you, because I think it's going to be relevant and just a helpful analogy to the point that you're making, and then take this in the direction that you want to. And so it's just because we can throw gasoline on the fire doesn't negate the question, why is there a fire at all? That was just helpful for me in terms of getting my head around the point that I think that you're making. Feel free to take that in whichever direction you were going to.
No, great point. I should have let you finish. I'll learn for the future.
Not at all.
So, okay, the topic of tectonic plates came up, and Sharon, you laid out that there are some benefits that come out of these disasters. So if a volcano erupts and it wipes out an entire ecosystem, hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of potentially sentient creatures dying, well, when the ash has set, and maybe several centuries on, it could be even millions of years on, what we will have is a prosperous society grow on that. And this is an indication that what it's telling us is that there are always silver linings. Well, the issue isn't that there's no silver linings. Someone like me isn't going to come in and say, these horrible, nasty things never produce something good. No, they almost always do. But that's not sufficient to be able to deal with the problem. You have to show that it's the greater good. It has to be better than the devastation and destruction that it caused. And on a surface level, this is outrageous when it comes to many of the disasters that we see with humans, let alone all of the disasters that happened long before us. It's interesting that you mentioned about third world countries suffering more than first world countries when it comes to these problems. I guess when that quote of the meek will inherit the earth, it quite literally meant the earth, because they wouldn't be able to build their structures in such a way as to preserve themselves from the earthquakes. The problem is that God designed these things. Now, it's true that we may exacerbate it, and sometimes it will be because we consciously are aware of what we should do, but we don't know, but we don't do anything better. So, for instance, if you know that earthquakes happen in a certain area, and then you build your civilization on that settlement in that area, then of course, there is a human element here involved. But this just isn't true for the hunter and gatherers that are our ancestors. They didn't know about the earth. They didn't know much at all. In fact, when it came to their gods, they believed there was a god for thunder, a god for the sky. They believed the earth was flat if you go back far enough. They didn't know these things, and God designed the world so that they didn't. He also designed them so that they wouldn't know about this. He also designed nature and gave these creatures claws explicitly to be used, teeth explicitly to be used. And he didn't just design these creatures in a way where he has to use them. Sometimes it's incredibly cruel. One example that comes to mind is the North American short-tailed shrew. It's a mammal that's developed venom, but the venom, it's toxic saliva. It doesn't kill the prey, it just subdues it, so that it can take the insect or worm or small creatures into its little environment and eat it alive over days. We are asked to believe not only that an all-loving God designed this deliberately, but somehow this is the best of all possible worlds. And to me, it just isn't good enough to look at this and go, well, maybe it's true, maybe we don't understand. Well, no, we have We don't act like this in any other domain of discourse. This is not the skepticism we do. This is, in fact, makes my skepticism look incredibly poor. You require the utmost skepticism to buy these kinds of propositions. So there's a couple of things addressed there, and yeah.
Thank you. No, I really appreciate you being candid with me, Stephen. And I just want to reiterate that it's really hard to talk about this as a kind of abstract thing that we both care about people that are caught up in the way that natural evil comes to land in our lives and the way that we see it portrayed in the natural world. I don't approach this kind of blithely or just something that I want to sort of brush away and have a sort of watertight logical answer that I can give you. But what I would just keep coming back to as I listen to you, all of those instances that you've named before me are under naturalism merely events. So why are we but when we get angry about them or feel like this is, by calling something a disaster, by attributing a kind of an emotional response to it, we're saying that things ought to be different. But where do the most persuasive explanations come from for that instinct, where that very instinct comes from? I say it makes more sense, actually, if God exists. So I am able to call it natural evil. I don't believe under naturalism you are.
Okay.
And so that's what it keeps. And I think that people that are not versed in philosophy, that is their intuitive response to the way that, disease and sickness and COVID-19 and everything, that it should be different. And actually, the Christian framework says that God is good and has created a good world. He can't create outside of his character. And so he has created a world that is good. But he created a world with the potential for evil. And somehow that potential became actual. Now, we can unpack what I mean by that. But what that means is we don't just have God in the framework for the theist. We actually there is such a thing as supernatural evil. And I've listened to your responses, and I know that you've heard a lot of Christians tie it up to a kind of a free will defense that is tied to human, a human fall. But actually, I think there are other ways of thinking about this that help us make sense of predation and mass extinction and so on, that in a way that predates human existence. But the essential elements being that we don't just have God in the framework, we have supernatural evil that has somehow woven itself into the natural world in ways that look like it's always been this way, but that actually it may not have always been this way. And that's part of where I'm coming from. I unpack that in Broken Planet as we get into the arguments.
That's amazing. Thank you for placing that down. I can respond to it on two lights. So, okay, the first light is that what someone is doing when they bring up this contradiction in omnimax theism is they're not presenting an alternative. They're saying your model doesn't make sense of the earth. And so what's coming across here is not here is a different account or a different way to ground ethics and morality. It's rather saying your view is incoherent. You don't make sense of the data. So having a way to actually instantiate morality or evil outside of a theistic framework is irrelevant to this. And it's why you don't see this objection come up much in the literature. It only really comes up with lay people, because it works on the intuitions and emotions by my lights and the way that I see it. But it doesn't come up much in the philosophy because they recognize it as an internal critique, pointing out there's a contradiction in the view. Now, when it comes to evil itself and to address the lay person, this is, or like the more common view, this is the way that I would address it. What do you think evil is? If you wouldn't mind, can you give me an answer of what you think evil is?
Evil is a personified being known as Satan that has some degree of influence in the world at the moment, but that won't forever. He's a created being, which is distinct from the creator. And so there's a difference in state of being, but he has a level of influence in the created world at this point, which is why it's a kind of valid, for the theist, a valid kind of way of making sense of natural evil, because there is indeed natural evil.
Okay, that's interesting. So a lot of the answers you get to that is basically going back to Aquinas, and what he says is that the world is good and anything that deviates from God's creation is evil. So he took a radically different view to what evil is compared to Aristotle, which based it in virtue ethics. And then, of course, as time has moved on, we've had like Kant and we've had Thomas Hobbes, where they're starting to talk about deontology, they're starting to talk about consequentialism, and the whole concept of suffering comes up, because none of them found divine command theory to be, frankly, anything to do with morality. What it's actually talking about is God said so, therefore it's right. So it's actually got nothing to do with suffering, nothing to do with evil in our intuitive sense. It's just simply, are you doing what the dictator says? I know this language is crass to the theist, but that's basically what's happening there. Whereas you're grounding evil in a being. So does that mean that he is responsible for all evil? So is it that the devil is the one that made the dinosaurs go extinct, for instance?
I think we really do need to be clear. There are lots of different kinds of kind of the ways in which nature has impacted life. I think probably the extinction of the dinosaurs, I see that as kind of quite an unusual event that doesn't seem to have, occurred many times, whereas there, when we're talking about predation. Pardon?
There's 4 other mass extinctions at least, wiping out 70% of life on Earth, 90% of life on Earth. Yeah. It's actually a regular feature.
Well, regular in the sense of 4 over billions of years. I guess there are just lots of different kinds of natural evil, and each kind requires a slightly different kind of response.
I guess one way you could clarify this for me then is, if this conscious being of the devil is what evil is, when he acts in order to bring, say, cancer on a human, or to erupt a volcano, or when he does something that under your view would count as natural, is it in all cases he is deliberately doing this? So, like, does he deliberately go out there and go, that community in the third world, I particularly don't like the third world, so I'm going to have more disasters happen there and make sure that, because they're going to exacerbate it because of their ignorance, or because they're not doing, what the big guy thinks is right? Is it all a conscious decision on the devil's part?
Yeah. I mean, this is a really great question. And we are getting into deep matters here, but I think the reason I kind of named my book Broken Planet is because I think it's hard to know, but I think that the impact of evil on nature is more at a kind of an endemic level, a little bit like when you drop some dye into water, it sort of infuses through the whole thing rather than squirting individual people. Just the whole network is broken. Well, it's got qualities that are both incredibly beautiful, pointing to the goodness of God, but also deeply broken, pointing to the reality of natural evil. And so it's kind of like a mesh that we're all caught up in. And what's interesting about the way you raise the question, Stephen, is that very often people's go-to is that it's God that's punishing them, that your suffering is a lightning bolt from God to you for something that you did that you don't even know about, and actually how far that is from the truth. In fact, the oldest story in the Bible chronologically is the book of Job, which I'm sure you're familiar with, and it's about a man who suffers greatly, and his friends all think that he is to blame and he's done something wrong, but actually we are party to a different dimension, which is that it's actually nothing to do with that. It's because of the reality of good and evil in the world, and so suffering is not divine punishment.
Well, on that front, does God control the devil?
Well,
is he more
this is
powerful?
another...
Could he click his fingers and get rid of him due to his omnipotence? And then the question is begged, or it comes up, if he's all loving, why hasn't he done it? How does this fall into your model?
Yeah, I think this is another really important question. I would want to say that the kind of theological thinking, there are lots of different opinions and voices out there, but that God didn't just create the earth with kind of free beings known as humans. He also created the heavens with free beings known as angels, and actually Satan is a fallen angel, which perhaps isn't too unfamiliar. That is this kind of fairly traditional Christian view on the origins of Satan. And the reason that was possible is because that the angelic realm also has free will, not just the human realm. And so there's something about God being committed to a world in which the beings that he has made can live meaningfully, whether that is in the heavenly realm or in the earthly realm. I'm aware now, Stephen, that this is where the way that I make sense of this just starts to differ and diverge quite differently from the way that you make sense of it, because as a theist I do have a different framework for thinking about this that does involve the supernatural. It involves things that are kind of unseen but have a seen effect in the world.
Well, I guess that would land, and I'll just be quick, Vince, if you wouldn't mind. What this would land on is your very concept of evil. Just it's not something that's a model that's used by basically anyone other than, in this case, the Christian, because of this, well, maybe you could say Abrahamic faiths, right? So when it comes to evil and defining evil from a naturalistic perspective, you're going to have something that pertains to suffering, something that pertains to our moral dispositions that either have evolved or is objective, depends on what kind of role that you come from. But the main point here is it does not matter whether or not the atheist can ground evil, because the critique is an inner critique. It's showing that the person who upholds an omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent God cannot say, end off, no ifs, no buts, cannot say there's gratuitous evil, there's an instance of evil that has no greater purpose. They have to say, no, it will serve and it is serving a greater purpose. And they have to do this, even if they can't explain it. They could say I'm epistemically blunted here, but they have to say that it is a greater good.
Thanks so much, guys, for the back and forth. Massively appreciate it, and we will pick up in the third segment of the show. So we'll definitely let you get back in there, Sharon. If I could just kind of frame how I'm hearing, some of the main contours of the discussion to this point. Just one way that's been helpful for me to think about this as I've listened to you both. On the one hand, the person who does believe in God has to be willing to say that there's some type of good reason that God could have for allowing these natural disasters, even if we don't fully comprehend what that is. On the other hand, Sharon has been saying that from her perspective, the atheist needs to be willing to say that in some sense, some of these natural disasters or evils are not actually, in a deep, fundamental sense, objectively evil. From an atheist perspective, Sharon would say, this is just nature doing its thing. And if I'm understanding correctly, Sharon is saying it's actually more unlikely to think these things are not actually objectively evil than to believe that God could have a reason for allowing them. And Stephen would say the opposite. Actually, it's more unlikely that God could have any type of good reason for allowing these things than to even think that perhaps these things are not fundamentally evil. You guys may want to come back on that, and we'll have a chance for that in the third segment. We have to pause there for now. Listeners, we're so glad you're part of this conversation. If you're enjoying it, take a moment to hit the subscribe button or rate the podcast. Help us to shape the future of these shows by emailing us your questions, your thoughts at unbelievable@premier.org.uk or on social media at unbelievablefe for X and at Premier Unbelievable for Instagram and Facebook. Today we're talking about natural evil. Would a good God really allow it? We'll be back in just a moment.
The mind and brain are connected, but the scientific data doesn't enable you to establish the nature of that connection or the relationship.
Just because science can't demonstrate that physical processes and mental processes are the same thing. That in and of itself doesn't give you any evidence that that's not the case either.
Some people talk about seeing deceased relatives and communicating with them.
This idea of floating up out of your body and watching things happen and being able to describe it afterwards, that could be formed in your imaginative mind.
Conscious experience and brain processes are two fundamentally different things.
I wonder if we're talking
Would
about...
you like me to go out for a bit? You guys seem really happy.
Welcome back. You're listening to Unbelievable with me, Vince Vitale, and my guests, Sharon Dirckx and Stephen Woodford. Still a lot of ground to cover in the last segment of this spirited episode and debate on a topic which is at once philosophical but also deeply personal, even sobering, the topic of natural evil, disasters, diseases, the harsh realities of our world. Are they better explained if God exists or if he doesn't? You guys were having some great back and forth at the end of the last segment. And Sharon, I know you were trying to get in there, so let me just throw it back to you to continue that conversation.
Yeah, thank you. Stephen, I was just thinking about your point about how, that these things must serve a greater good. I mean, I think that obviously you know that the Christian perspective is that there's a bigger perspective. The story isn't finished yet. I'm sure we'll get to that in our conversation. But even before we get to that, actually where I stand with this is that, and certainly at a personal level, when people try and impose this idea that there's a greater good or there's something that God wants to teach you or that things happen for a reason, is this terrible phrase that we've got in the UK. I actually find that really problematic. I think that these things happen because the world is broken, because we live on a broken planet and it's endemic to everyone and we're all caught up in it. It's not that there is sometimes there is no greater good that comes out of it, certainly not in this life. Obviously we have the perspective of a life to come and we can get to that. But there are things in this world for which we don't always get a reason. We don't always get a kind of a sense of there being something bigger or greater. It's just messed up. The world is broken. And it's both beautiful and it's broken. And both of those point to both the reality of God who wants to be with us in the midst of it and the reality of evil that has kind of woven its way in. So I don't think I would subscribe to that kind of standard view that there must be a greater good for every form of suffering. We're talking about deeply mysterious things here.
Okay. Forgive my transparency, but that would, and correct me if I'm mistaken, but that would actually mean you're conceding the argument. Because let's talk about a broken world, right? So we have this situation where the world is broken, and this is often the full theodicy defense, right? It's a defense of why things are the way that they are. The full theodicy, of course, struggles with the fact that it presupposes that animals didn't exist for billions of years before us. So there's issues with the science. But in any case, you have this story of a broken world. Why is it broken? An all-powerful, all-loving God is responsible for the earth. So why is it broken? Well, if he's all-powerful, he could have made it so that it's not broken. So the fact that it is broken indicates, in fact entails, that he had a good reason to allow it to be broken. Now, normally this is cashed out in the free will theodicy, the free will defense. But of course, that's going to have absolutely nothing to say about the dinosaurs. It's going to have nothing to say about the billions of creatures that have suffered long before we existed. And if there are other creatures in the universe, it's going to have nothing to say about that either. Well, almost certainly not, unless you're going to, by my lights, bend over backwards in order to achieve that. So what normally happens is the theist will say, look, the world is broken, but this is the best of all possible worlds. Trust me. God wanted to give us free will so that we could build our soul, cultivate our characters, And that leads to us being able to go to heaven, at least those that accept Jesus. For some reason, atheists like me, it doesn't matter how much I think about it, I'm going to go, according to a lot of Christians, to hell forever. Still, this has to be the best of all possible worlds. Whereas what you're saying is that, no, there are instances in the world where, no, that doesn't serve a greater good. That actually is just gratuitous evil. But to say that is to say that an all-powerful, all-loving God doesn't exist.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't say that it does. It's more that that actually it's a reminder that the world that we live in is broken, but it's been allowed to be broken. I suppose I'm not conceding the argument in the sense that I do believe that God was committed to a particular kind of world, to create a particular kind of world. And there are two elements to that. One is that it's a life-permitting world, which was my earlier point about some of the mechanisms that underlie these cataclysmic events actually have a vital role. They're not just a nice add-on, but without them, we actually wouldn't exist. Even viruses. If you got rid of all viruses on Earth, we'd survive a couple of days and then that would be it. But, occasionally there's a pathogenic strain that threatens our existence. But overall, God was committed to a life-permitting universe. And also the free will theodicy, I recognise its limitations, but it does have some relevance when you think about the natural world, that there's a need to have a regularity in the laws of nature so that we can live meaningfully. I just saw you pick up a drink from your table. If suddenly the laws of nature change so that when you went to pick that up, it flew off into the air, then you actually can't make the meaningful choice to drink the water because the laws of nature are changing around you. So there needs to be a stability and a regularity for humans to live meaningfully as well. And I guess arguably for animals too, and they probably understand the natural world far better than we do with their kind of relationship with nature and the ecosystems that they're embedded in. And so you could make a case that although the kind of human free will doesn't get us to where we need to be in with natural evil on one level, but in terms of its impact, the impact the laws of nature have on our use of our free will, there is still something to say there. So I suppose in a way, God is committed to the ultimate good of us living in a life-permitting universe where we can live meaningfully. So I suppose if that counts as an overall good, I am committed to those things. I think at an individual level, trying to imply that there's a greater good at a person-by-person level is insensitive and not very helpful.
That's helpful. And I'm just going to make a quick connection with a point earlier in our conversation. Feel free to pick up on it if it seems useful. But I thought that was interesting, Stephen, earlier when we talked about, is there any evidence that, could potentially, at least on first glance, points toward a God, existence itself was one of the things that you noted. Sharon, you now seem to be arguing that some of the at least processes that allow for the natural evil in the world is essential for us to exist. Is there any connection between those points in the conversation? I just thought that was interesting, as Stephen was noting existence as something which could point in the direction of theism. And Sharon, you're saying that perhaps the natural evil in the world is essential to the existence of life itself. Any thoughts on that?
I guess it's coming down to semantics, whether we call those events evil or not. One of the arguments that I make in my book is that and this is where I agree with Stephen, they're events, they're geophysical events, and there are volcanic eruptions happening all the time on Venus, and there's a storm on Jupiter that calls for a redefinition of the term extreme weather. Why don't we refer to those as natural disasters? Well, because nobody gets hurt by them. They're not evil, they're actually quite magnificent and leave us in awe, but the problem is that when we start to interact with the natural world, then people get hurt, and that's where we start to introduce the language of disasters. So it depends on what disaster, what events we're talking about, and it depends the extent to which humans are involved. One argument is that these things are not evil in and of themselves because they have a life-sustaining role. Yeah.
In and of themselves. Okay. And on the other hand, you might think, some would think that there's a problem of evil also for atheist, in the sense of, can an atheist truly call these things evil? We've kind of talked around that topic, but Stephen, I'd be interested to hear you share a bit about how you think about that relationship between, a challenge that's based on these things being evil, but then also, and I understand, you see it as an internal consistency problem for the theist, but is there a kind of separate problem for atheism in terms of understanding these things as evil or just as natural processes?
Okay, so when it comes to, so just to reiterate to me, I know you've said it, but it should be really clear. Whether or not an atheist or a naturalist can ground evil is irrelevant to the argument of an all-powerful, all-loving God, because it's an inner critique. It's an entailment of what happens of God. To bring up, the naturalist can't account for evil, is to fundamentally misunderstand the dialectic. That's by my lights, at least, and that's why you don't see this raised in the literature often.
Just one quick thought on that, because I do see what you're saying, that logically it's an internal consistency question for this, but I was just thinking about it in terms of, imagine, this is real life, right? Someone is trying to make the decision, should I be a theist or an atheist? And so they're trying to kind of weigh up, which of those major starting point worldviews has the heavier cost. Like, for which of those do I need to subscribe to something that I find more unlikely? And so from that perspective, I can imagine someone saying, okay, it's really hard for me to believe that a good God could have a reason for these natural evils. That's a heavy cost I would need to accept if I were a theist. On the atheist side, if being an atheist meant that I couldn't call these things evil in some deep sense, that's a heavy cost too. So I find myself torn between these two major worldviews as my starting point in terms of which philosophy to subscribe to. That's how I think that there's some relevance there.
I think that's a useful way to approach it. So allow me to extend with it. So suppose you had three people, and three people started looking at the world. They started living their lives, and they started thinking to themselves, is there actually such a thing as evil? What is evil? How do we account for it? Suppose suppose two of them decided that there is evil, and one person decided there actually isn't, not really. And however they cashed it out is not really relevant, right? In any case, that's where their conclusion lands. Now, one of them, say the person that cashes it out and says that there is no evil, will notice that there's just no problem. He doesn't need to account for evil in the world because he doesn't have or like suffering in the earth or anything like that, because it's just not a problem under the commitments that he's bought. He might not like it. He might be repulsed by it because of evolutionary tendencies or something along those lines, but there just is no issue, which is why this problem isn't a problem for naturalists. It's just, there's nothing inherent to naturalism to say that you will affirm a certain view on specifically benevolence and things along those lines. Whereas when you've got the two people that affirm that there is something that's real and it's evil, well, you could say there is real evil, and I'm going to ground it under a naturalistic worldview, or that's the way that I see it. Okay, well, is there a problem with you accounting for there being gratuitous evil in the world? Well, no, because you don't have the problem of having an omnibenevolent, omniscient, omnipotent being. So actually, when it comes to, look at all of the disasters around the earth, no, that's just evil. I can make sense of it. Whereas if you affirm that there is evil, and you cash it out by also buying the proposition of an all-powerful, all-loving God, then you have your issues there. So yeah, like you could look at all of this data and come to those three conclusions.
But the problem is, I suppose, when I just talk to people on the street, or my family members, or just friends at the school gate, or wherever you don't have to be thinking philosophically to have an instinctive response that this is not the way it should be, that we don't actually have to think, is there such a thing as evil? We actually intuitively assume there's something wrong with the world.
Yep.
When people get angry, like even Stephen Fry in his video, even his voice, his tone was like, this is not the way things ought to be, and he was aiming that argument at God. But it doesn't seem to be something that we need to invoke in people. It's intuitively there that there's something, the way that things are in the world is not how they should be, and the only persuasive grounding for that that I can see is that that's because that we live in a world that is both good and broken.
Okay.
And the existence of God makes best sense of that.
Okay, so by my lights, we're well off course. And really what's being asked now is, Steve, how do you account for moral intuitions? And I'm happy to give that answer. So I think that we've evolved. We're a social species. And I think that all social species are going to be running social software. And the reason for that is that our ancestors that didn't have this love thy neighbor essence within them, which you find in all religions, and in Christianity you find it explicitly, those that didn't have that didn't survive because they acted selfishly, they didn't love their neighbors, they didn't cultivate an environment that allowed them to flourish, and consequently the ones that survived got to reproduce, and those essences, those genes, they proliferated. And that's why, as a social species, we now love thy neighbor largely, because it's not perfect. But again, the fact that it's not perfect, the fact that it is always changing, the fact that 200 years ago women weren't allowed to be authoritative to men, but now it's okay, the fact that slavery has been absolutely fine throughout almost all of human history, including under the dominion of Christianity, and yet in recent years, largely because of the Enlightenment, largely after the Enlightenment, at least that has to be admitted, the fact that that's changed. All of this is data that has to be considered when you're trying to think about our moral intuitions and where they come from. It's not good enough to say Aquinas was just wrong when he was quoting Leviticus and quoting Jesus telling slaves to obey their masters. Rather, you need to be able to make sense of all the data. And I think by far, the best way to explain the data is to say we are a social species, and what morality is grounded in that fact. We love our neighbor.
I think that's really fascinating. It's fascinating that you've taken a line from the words of Jesus, though, as where it's kind of ended up. But the thing is with biological evolution, adaptation, and so on, is that there's nothing in the mechanism that says that you ought to be a certain way. The mechanism simply describes the way things are. So you're right in saying that, if people behave more kindly to each other, then that makes reproduction more likely, and the species as a whole are more likely to survive, meaning that set of moral apparatus continues into the next generation. But there's nothing in the mechanism to say that they ought to be kind to each other. The mechanism simply is. And actually, you could argue there are other ways that outcome could have been achieved. What if you rape all the women? That would also enable survival to continue to the next generation. Or what if you get rid of the elderly, who are a slight drain on the gene pool?
That's a fantastic
hang on,
example.
Let me just finish.
Oh, of course, sorry.
So if you get rid of the elderly members of this population, that might also enable survival, because these guys have long outlived their reproductive fitness and they're a bit of a drain on resources. And so that would enable survival as well, in a different set of moral apparatus. And so using an evolutionary approach to morality, you can end up with a variety of different outcomes. And there's nothing to say in the mechanisms that any of these is more moral than the other. If you want to appeal to one of them being more moral, you're actually appealing to a standard that is outside of nature, not within nature itself. And therefore, the moral outcomes of evolution are essentially arbitrary. I don't think you can use that to ground morality. You're appealing to a standard that is outside of nature, that is actually objective. And
Okay, so lots to respond to. Wonderfully put. Hopefully I can do a good job of being succinct. So you bring up not being able to get an ought from an is. And I absolutely agree. I think David Hume's correct. You cannot get an ought from an is. But we're not born, when you're describing evolution, you're just describing what's going on. And because you're using descriptions, you're only using is statements. But you in yourself are not evolution. Rather, you're a product of evolution. And you were born with certain oughts, which is to say that you were born with emotional impulses to do certain things, to achieve certain things.
Why was I born with certain oughts? Where do they come from? Because the mechanism can't account for them.
Yes, it can, because what it will say is those that are born with the ought of I ought to get resources to consume so that I can survive, obviously they survive. So evolution has a reason to select for those oughts to be within you. And then once you have an ought, well, actually you can get an ought from an ought, because you can say it ought to be the case that I consume food. Now, whether or not you can ground this is actually irrelevant. You just are born with it. It's part of the social software you've got. Then you can say it is the case. If I go to the bush over there, I will get resources. Therefore, I ought to do it. It follows from an ought from an ought. You gave an example of rape, and I think that's a fair example of something that violates our moral intuitions today. If you take the Bible out and you turn to Numbers 31, 17 through 18, what is said in that book is that God told Moses and the Israelites to go down into a settlement and to kill all of the males, to kill all of the women that had laid with a man, it's explicit, and to kill all of the little boys. You're talking Auschwitz level of cruelty here. They would have been taking those babies and smashing their skulls against rocks because God commanded it. But it explicitly states, keep all of the little ones that have not lied with a man for yourself. It doesn't take too much of a genius to figure out what's going on there. Now, the theist, of course, needs to make sense of this data, and you can watch it with William Lane Craig, with others, by my lights. This is a really big thorn in Christianity. The founding fathers of America certainly believed it was. It's been a big thorn for a very, very long time. But notice that what you mentioned about the evolutionary theory, it actually does a better job of making sense of the data. It does better explain why morals seem to change per generation. Seems that unfortunately, or fortunately, we are easily molded towards our environment. Makes better sense of the fact that so many cultures and so many societies today have completely juxtaposed positions, whereas none of that's predicted on theism.
And if I could just jump in, I would just, this has been great. We're covering a lot of ground, and the way that I see this as relevant, all the different portions of this, conversation, is, Sharon, I think you're questioning, is there a sort of, could there be an inconsistency within naturalism or atheism if the naturalist is both committed to only natural processes, but also wants to say that natural disasters are objectively evil in some deep fundamental sense? Steve is saying that maybe we don't need to say that in that deep fundamental sense that maybe you would ascribe to as a religious person, and he would push back in the other direction and say there seems to be an internal inconsistency within your worldview if you're claiming that God is all loving and yet seems to allow these things which appear to be the opposite of loving. So I personally, I think there's been really good challenge there in both directions, and we have to wrap up for this episode at least. But I'd love to just throw it to each of you, and we really only have time for 15 seconds each here. But if you were to leave our listeners with one thought to sort of take away from this episode, and I hope we can continue this conversation another time as well, what would that be? I'll throw it to you first, Sharon.
Yeah, thanks, Vince. I would actually want to say that whatever the reasons for the kind of world that we have, it was one that God himself was prepared to enter into as the person of Jesus Christ, and in doing that has not left us alone in our suffering. And I guess that's at the heart of what a Christian would say, that we, on whatever life throws at us, whatever our interaction with natural evil, we're not on our own. This forms the basis also of humanitarian aid, forms the basis of why you might even help someone in a form of like medical care, social work, and so on. I believe that if God exists, that he has not left us alone in our suffering, and therefore there's hope, and he's also not finished, and there's hope for today, and there's hope for the future as well.
Okay. Thanks, Sharon. How about you, Steve?
I would say that even if it is the case that naturalism couldn't ground evil, it actually has no relevance to the objections that's been raised today. It simply is not a relevant factor. The second thing I would say is taking the greater good argument and supposing that potentially it's for the greater good. Potentially this is the best of all possible worlds. We don't operate with that level of skepticism ever. And normally when an atheist brings kind of skepticism of that level, theists sometimes rightfully point out that it's a mistake. We could say, for instance, last Thursdayism, which is the view that last Thursday everything was created, all started then. No one takes this seriously, but it is possible. That is the same thing that's happening with the profound gratuitous evil in the world. What happens is the theist will look at it and go, maybe, but that ain't good enough. Not by my lights. And I don't think an all-loving God would think it's good enough either.
Guys, fantastic conversation. Thank you for all that you've invested in it. Thoughtful, robust, spirited, gracious. Really appreciate it. I'm Vince Vitale. We've been speaking with Stephen Woodford and Sharon Dirckx about a philosophical but also deeply personal topic, the natural evil in our world that affects us all. I hope you'll continue this conversation by checking out Stephen's YouTube channel, Rationality Rules, or picking up a copy of Sharon's book, Broken Planet. You can find links to both in the episode description. While you're at it, hit the subscribe button, leave us a review. Be sure to follow on social media at Unbelievable FE on X and at Premier Unbelievable on Facebook and Instagram. Thank you for joining me for Unbelievable, where we are committed to bringing people together around the questions that matter most to all of us. See you next time.